Hello, everyone. I hope that you all are having a great holiday weekend so far. Like I mentioned on Friday, I wanted to record this video lecture just to give us a chance to go into deeper detail on some of the um, segregation practices and laws that were in existence in South Africa prior to 1948. Some of what's going to be covered on these slides are going to be touched on by some of our groups that are going to be doing their presentations on Tuesday. This will be a chance for me to go in greater detail on this, and also some of our groups on Tuesday for their presentations will touch on some of these laws and these practices that were in existence to prior to 1948. And we really want to have a chance to touch on these because much of our focus this week and into parts of next week are going to be on laws that were in existence during apartheid era South Africa. And we'll spend much of our time digging into exactly what those laws were, why they were in existence, and how exactly they affected and discriminated against the Native African population in South Africa. But getting an understanding for exactly how these laws came into existence in the first place and kind of their predecessors, this video lecture is going to give us a chance to kind of dig deeper into that. So we'll go ahead and jump into it. So I mentioned that this is coming from the part of our rights and protest text that goes along with this case study, Apartheid in South Africa. So instead of having y'all read this, I said that I was going to do a video lecture instead. But if you would like to have a chance to take a look at the reading, much of the information that's going to be on these slides and what I'll be talking through are on pages 15 to 19 of the Origins of Apartheid section of the text. So when I post this video on our Google Classroom page, I'll also post the text that goes along with this if you would like to have a chance to read through that and be able to see where some of this information is coming from. Okay. So we'll go ahead and jump into this with the first section of this part of the text discussing segregation and early practice. So we're not really getting into laws that were put in place once the Union of South Africa was created, right? So at the beginning of the country, this is just early practice of segregation that was in existence while the four provinces were still in large parts the political scene, right? So we have our four provinces of Cape Province, the Transvaal, Natal, and the Orange Free State. So we talked a lot last week about the origins of the British and the Afrikaners, the Boers, the Dutch, right? Exactly how they came into creating and establishing a colony in South Africa and establishing their rule. And there's also we want to think of this as two separate origin stories of racism and segregation in South Africa. Specifically from the perspective of the Afrikaners. Much of their reasoning for why segregation was necessary in their viewpoint and discrimination against Native Africans was that Afrikaners viewed themselves as God's chosen people. So this sense is really coming from this biblical destiny to rule over South Africa. So the Afrikaners and their version of Protestant Christianity that they practiced, much of their ideas were drawing from the Bible and coming from these ideas that it was their God-given right to rule over this land in South Africa, and for them to be the ones in charge in making the rules and establishing their authority from an early start. The British, on the other hand, there was this long-held assumption that throughout the early stages of British rule that they were ruling with a paternalistic outlook, that in a sense they were governing with the best interests of Africans in mind, right? But as we see, and as we've seen already from what we've discussed in class, and we'll see as we go through these slides, that wasn't necessarily the case. A lot of the practices from the government and viewpoints in society really stem from this idea that there was a clear distinction, there was a clear hierarchy, that the white populations living in South Africa viewed themselves um, as dominant or greater than the native Africans, right? So in Cape Colony, as settlements in Cape Colony started to grow during this time period in the early stages of Cape Colony in the early to mid 1800s, right? The Hosa peoples, so this is one of the groups of native Africans that were living in the southern part of Africa during this time, right? And so the Hosa peoples, like we talked about last week, they were living near the proximity of the Cape Province, right? They were living just east of Cape Province. And so as they were wanting to search for work, they actually started to travel further west. They started to move into Cape Province to look for work in cities and farms. And this would have a big impact later on in terms of creating this establishment of white backlash that we see happening in a lot of the cities during this time. So we jump to 1853, and Cape Colony creates a new constitution. And in this constitution, they specifically write in there that there is a clear distinction between what they see as civilized versus uncivilized peoples in the Cape Province. They don't necessarily spell out who is considered civilized or uncivilized, but there are clear implications that they view Native Africans as uncivilized, kind of going back to this idea that it was the two white populations, the British and the Afrikaners. It was their duty to civilize, to rule over the native Africans because they were viewed as uncivilized. And with the creation of this new constitution, it also led to the first use of passes in South African society, which we will get into. We'll see that come up later in pre-1948 history, but that'll play a really big role in the apartheid era South Africa when we start to get into laws that were put into existence during the 1950s. So these passes essentially were IDs that Hosa peoples in Cape Colony were required to carry with them. So basically, anytime that they left their house or place of employment, they were forced to carry these passes around with them, and they were in a sense a way for the British government to track the movement of African peoples, to make sure to keep tabs on them and to try and see how it is that they could go about not only controlling the population, but keeping them from interacting with the British as much as possible. Um, and these passes were also, in a sense, required Native Africans from being able to leave their jobs and look for work elsewhere. So basically, where it is that they worked, they weren't allowed to freely go searching for employment for work in other areas, in other types of employment. They were really limited in terms of exactly what it is that they could and couldn't do. As Cape Town grows larger in the 1890s, more and more Native Africans, specifically groups of people who are coming from present day Mozambique, which is just north of South Africa, are starting to come down into the Cape Province and move to cities such as Cape Town. And this is where we start to see more and more increasing instances of white backlash and greater instances of discrimination against Native African peoples living in cities. And we start to see things really starting to boil over and lead to increased tensions in the cities. There's an outbreak of bubonic plague that hits Cape Town in 1901. And as a result, as a reaction to this, we see the first act of legal residential segregation that's implemented in South African society. So there's a creation of an African-only township called Ndabeni. So we'll see townships start to pop up and become more of a norm, become more normalized in a sense as the decades go on, and even into the 1940s and 50s and 60s. These townships, in a sense, were areas where mostly Native Africans were living, segregated away from white areas in urban spaces and cities, in a sense. So we want to jump over to the kind of leave where we are in the Cape Province and jump over to the Afrikaner republics, specifically the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. And we talked about last week that the practice of slavery was outlawed in the British Empire in 1833. And so, as a provision, so as a requirement, the British government forced the Transvaal and the Orange Free State in treaties that they signed in the 1850s to not practice slavery, saying that it wasn't that they weren't allowed to practice it and that the British government was going to, in a sense, kind of keep tabs on it to make sure that this happened. But essentially, practice of slavery still existed in these republics after 1833. And during the mineral revolution that we talked about, that occurred in specifically in the Orange Free State and the Transvaal, right, during the 1870s and 1880s with the discovery of diamonds and gold. This led to the growth of Johannesburg, right, one of the largest city in South Africa today, and where a lot of the mining industry was based. And as Johannesburg and the mining industry began to grow, a lot of the wealth that was in the mining industry was being held by a few English-speaking businessmen who became known as landlords. And these landlords still have prominence even into apartheid era South Africa. So it's really important that we establish that who these people are and understand how they're going to come up later on in time as we go further into our case study. So after the South African War, if you remember, from 1899 to 1902, this is also known as the Second Boer War, right? Afrikaner farmers and these landlords started to petition and ask the governments of in the provinces before it became the Union of South Africa, right? That they didn't want to lose African workers that they depended on. A lot of Afrikaner farmers and landlords in the mining industry depended on African workers because mainly that they could get them to do the work that they were doing while also paying them very cheaply. Because during this time, African workers weren't allowed to be able to negotiate for better pay or for better working conditions. So they depended on this cheap labor, and they didn't want to risk losing African workers to go look for jobs elsewhere. So they wanted these protections from the government. And as this eventually led, as we skip ahead a few years, to the creation of the Union of South Africa. From an Afrikaner and British perspective, one of the things that the two white populations wanted to focus on in terms of creating this new government is that they wanted to emphasize the fact that from their perspective, the growth of South African economy, the growth of the country's economy, and it rebounding from the South African War, it depended on planning from the national level, from the government really having a say and input on helping industries grow, helping stimulate the economy. It depended on government intervention from the national level and systemic segregationist policies. In a sense, we'll see this as a way of saying that there were protections for white workers while there weren't protections for Native African workers. And we'll see that play a big part in the years to come as well. So now we get into the system of segregation. So now we are in the era of the Union of South Africa. South Africa is its own independent country now, and we have the ruling party, the South African Party, with Smuts, right? With Smuts in charge. Botha and Smuts are in charge of the country during this time. So for the next few slides, we're going to go over a few different laws, these acts that were passed over the years. So we'll touch on each of these laws and specifically how they related in many parts to the economy, but also its political implications as well too. How it affected the say of the white populations in government and the lack of say, the lack of representation for Native Africans in government and being able to voice their concerns, being able to have a chance to be able to push back against these segregationist policies. So one of the first laws that we want to touch on is the Mines and Works Act of 1911. And this law basically said that all semi-skilled positions in the mining industry, so any skilled positions where somebody has training, these were reserved for white workers only. So in a sense, African workers couldn't access these positions. They could only access lower paying, unskilled positions in the mining industry and on farms. So we start to see this division of pay and access to types of jobs between the white populations and Native Africans. The Natives Land Act of 1913, which this is a really key and really crucial piece of legislation, a really impactful law that was passed that I know a few groups are touching on in their presentations. But essentially, this was the forerunner to the homeland system or the system of Bantustans, which we'll touch on further in later this week whenever we start to talk about some of the laws that were passed that essentially led to greater lengths of residential segregation. So essentially, the Natives Land Act of 1913 limited African land ownership to native reserves / territories. So there were areas of land that were set aside by the national government that said that if you were a Native African, you could only own land in these areas of South Africa. These native reserves only accounted for 7.5% of the total land area. And keep in mind that Native Africans made up over 2/3 of the population of South Africa, of the entire country. And only 7.5% of the total land area was set aside for them to be able to live, to reside in. So this created a really intense strain on overcrowding of these areas and poor quality of health for Native Africans during this time. That still played a big role and impact later on into the apartheid era of the 40s, 50s, and 60s that we'll start to get into. And there were some exceptions, but the only exception was that Africans could reside outside of the reserves if they were employed by white employers. So that was the only exception that they had to be able to live outside of the native reserves areas, is that if they were employed and living near their place of employment that was owned and that was led by a white person. So that was the only exception, that they had to be able to live outside of the native reserves. Now we get into the Natives or Urban Areas Act of 1923. And so essentially this was the law that basically stated that cities, urban areas, were for the use of the white population only, and that if Africans were present in the cities, in these urban areas, that they would have to carry a pass. So now we're starting to see these pass laws come back up again like we did in the 1800s. And so essentially it was the same system that the passes worked in the 1800s, that if Native Africans were present in these urban areas, they had to carry this pass with them at all times or be subject to removal and being forced to leave and go back to the native reserves and territories. The Industrial Conciliation Act of 1924 was another law that impacted workers, and specifically put a greater divide between the haves of white South Africans and the have-nots of Native Africans, right? So essentially, this was a law that said that white skilled workers were able to create trade unions, to be able to unionize and to negotiate for better pay or working conditions. However, African workers couldn't unionize, so they weren't allowed to be able to have these same types of privileges as white workers to be able to negotiate for better pay or working conditions in their places of employment. So we want to remind ourselves that during this time in 1924, the National Party under JBM Herzog, right, comes to power. And as Herzog comes to power, he institutes these new policies that he likes to call civilized labor, going even further than Botha and Smuts did to protect white workers in South Africa. Starting off with the Wage Act of 1925, this was essentially a way for the government to instruct, they forced private companies to give hiring preferences to white workers, putting a further strain on the economy in terms of the types of jobs that Native Africans could have versus the ones that they couldn't have. And we see that like we talked about last week, right? That the Great Depression plays a major role. It plays a big impact in the South African economy. The economy starts to hurt, and Smuts and Herzog unite to form the United Party, right? So they bring their two parties, the South African Party and the National Party, together to be able to pool together their resources to try and stimulate the economy and to lessen the hurt, lessen the damage from the Great Depression. And so after the United Party comes to power, they start to pass a series of laws. One of the first ones is the Representation of Natives Act of 1936. And so this essentially was a political measure to remove any Africans that were still on the electoral roll in Cape Province, right? So any Africans that were on the electoral roll in Cape Province were now purged completely from that list, and they were no longer allowed to have any voting privileges. During this time, also as a part of this act, there was creation of this council called the Natives Representation Council. That was, in a way, Smuts and Herzog's way to say, well, we understand that there is a lot of frustration and a lot of pushback from Native Africans in terms of having representation of government and having a say to be able to voice concerns that they have. So this was their way to create a pathway, to create an avenue to be able to voice these concerns. But in a sense, this Natives Representation Council had no real power or influence. It was essentially just kind of as you see, a slap in the face type of a gesture to Native Africans to try and say, we'll give you some say, but we're not actually going to give you any say at all. The Native Trust and Land Act of 1936 was an expansion of the Natives Reserved Act of 1913. So this expanded the area of native reserves in South Africa to 13% of the total area. But however, this was never really achieved in practice. So even though the total area of native reserves grew, it never grew to that 13% that the government had set aside. And this also gave the government power to evict Native Africans who were living illegally in white areas. So this led to even more of an increase in tensions and backlash within urban areas, within cities in particular. The 1937 Native Laws Amendment Act was, in a sense, a way to put forth stricter enforcement of the past laws. So this was a stronger crackdown on these passes that Native Africans were being forced to carry when they were in so-called white areas within the cities. So this was a greater scrutiny, a greater surveillance of the movement of Native Africans in cities, and for the government to be able to control exactly where they were allowed to go and places that they could go versus places that they couldn't go. So also during this time, as we start to get towards the end of the 1930s, there's a group that pops up that really aligns themselves with the Purified National Party, the GNP. So remember, the Purified National Party, that's D.F. Mullen and his supporters, this group of really hardline, radical Afrikaner nationalists who are wanting to push back against um, the rising level of Native Africans who are living in close proximity to cities and to the white populations. There's this group called the Afrikaner Broederbond, and the Broederbond they were an extremist and populist group that was supportive of Afrikaner nationalism. And both the Broederbond and the Purified National Party had a lot of support from poor Afrikaners who, during this time period, felt isolated by the so-called elitist United Party government. Um, so this is a way for both the Purified National Party and the Broederbond to be able to gather a lot of support from the Afrikaner population to kind of catapult their level of influence and their political standing within South Africa. And during World War II, wartime society led to more Africans living in urban areas in so-called squatter camps. So if you remember, during this time, during World War II, there was a great increase in the manufacturing industry. So more people were moving to cities to take part in this manufacturing industry. And as a result, that meant there needed to be more places for people to live. But as we also also recall too from earlier in the slides, right, that there was a restriction of movement for Native Africans in cities, in urban areas, right? So that's why these squatter camps, these, in a sense, kind of like want to think of it as like temporary housing or temporary living areas, right? Within cities, within urban areas, these started to pop up, and Native Africans who were living in these areas grew more and more militant towards the white government, in a sense, meaning that they were more and more willing to engage in armed conflict and armed struggle against the white government. And in a sense, we kind of see that start to creep up as we talked about last week too, right? With the creation of the African National Congress Youth League and also the South African Communist Party. There were a lot of these groups that were existing in cities, in these urban areas, right? Wanting to organize, to gather support, wanting to mobilize against the white government, the minority white government in charge, right? To be able to push back against a lot of these discriminatory and racist segregation laws that were put in existence. And we skip ahead to 1946 just a little bit, and we see that there is this strike that happens. The African Mine Workers Union goes on strike in 1946, and close to 100,000 gold miners participate in the strike for better pay and working conditions. And as a result of the strike, the police, South African police, confront the strikers, and as a result of this confrontation, 9 protesters were killed by police in this confrontation. And as a result of this event, the government during this time, led by Smuts, right, and the United Party, they respond with creating this commission and issuing this report. And this commission, this group, tasked with coming up with a response to this event. They were called the Fagan Commission. So in a sense, the Fagan Commission issues this report that says that the South African government needs to normalize. They need to make it more acceptable for Africans living in urban spaces with white South Africans. It's in a way they're saying that there are going to be more and more Native Africans living in cities and urban spaces with white South Africans, and that it's the government's role to make sure that they do everything possible to make sure that it is as cohesive as possible, in a sense. However, Malin and the newly reformed National Party, they come up with their own response. And their response is through a different commission called the Sauer Commission. In a sense, they respond by saying the complete opposite of what the Fagan Commission wrote. The Sauer Commission says that in order to ensure the survival of white identity and to ensure the survival of the Afrikaner and British identity, that there needs to be a complete separation of the races in South African society. And as we know, Malin and his party, the newly formed National Party, comes to power in 1948 during the general election, right? A few years after the strike happens. And a lot of what they campaigned on and they were focusing on stemmed from this report, stemmed from this Sauer Commission, saying that there needs to be a greater resurgence, there needs to be more scrutiny of segregation in South African society, and that's what helps lead to the creation of the apartheid state and some of these more strict and discriminatory laws that we're going to focus on later this week and in the next week that pop up in the 1950s. So this is our overview of that section of the reading. Like I said, the actual text that goes along with it, I will post it on Google Classroom along with this video for you all to be able to listen to watch, to follow along, and gain some insight to give us a better understanding of where we're going to be when we pick up after we finish up our presentations on Tuesday. Everyone enjoy the rest of your holiday weekend, and we'll see you on Tuesday when we get back to school.